Environmental justice has a history that goes back for about 40 years, and it started with protests in Warren County, North Carolina in the early 1980s. Even though there were other protests similar to it that were going on at the time, what made Warren County unique is that it got national attention, and it led to a chain reaction of other things that eventually led to an executive order on environmental justice in 1994, an executive order that was articulated by President Bill Clinton. I think it's important for people to know that environmental justice in the U.S. has had a very strong and distinct racial dimension to it. The U.S. has had a long history of racial discrimination, and it wasn't until the civil rights laws of the 1960s, which is only about 50 years ago, where there was legislation to abolish the discriminatory practices that were prevalent in the U.S. But I think it's also important to know that even with those laws, a lot of the damage had already been done, because a lot of those laws resulted in African Americans and other people of color living in segregated communities. And two of the consequences of that was lack of investment in the communities and the resulting deprivation in terms of quality education and job opportunities and so on. I think another negative impact from that segregation was that whites did not see how African Americans and other people of color were, what kind of conditions that they lived in, and unfortunately, I think when things are out of the sight of people, even for those with good intentions, it's outside out of mind. Warren County was very important because in the 1980s, people tended to think about environmental problems as affecting everyone, therefore they affect us all equally. And what Warren County was saying was, well, wait a minute, it looks like maybe some people are more impacted than others. And one of the consequences of the Warren County protests was that one of the civil rights organizations, the Commission for Racial Justice of the United Church of Christ, had commissioned a nationwide study to see whether what was going on at Warren County and other places in the South were part of a national pattern. And it was the first national study to look at the demographics around hazardous waste sites. And they found very pronounced and statistically significant differences in terms of the concentration of poor people and African Americans and other people of color around where hazardous waste sites are located. And that report came out in 1987, and it was a report that got the attention of a lot of people in the U.S., including academics, including myself. That was the first environmental justice analysis that I read, and it made me wonder whether other studies like it existed and whether they showed similar patterns. And when I started to work on that, I also met the first African American environmental studies professor that I had ever met when I started working at the University of Michigan, and he and I began working on environmental justice projects together. One of the important things I think we did was we organized in 1990 a conference that brought together academics around the U.S. who were also interested in this topic and doing research on it. When we invited them, we also invited representatives from the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, and our conference had an impact on those that were present, and they helped us to draft a letter to the head of the EPA in 1990, and as a result of that letter, we were invited to talk to the head of the EPA, and from those meetings, the EPA sponsored its own study and report on environmental justice, which came out in 1992. And it came out with a review of the evidence, and it also came up with draft policy proposals. The policy proposals were heavily criticized for not going far enough by the environmental justice community. But one of the really important impacts of that report was that it represented the first official acknowledgement by any agency of the federal government, let alone the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, that environmental injustice was a real problem, and that the agency needed to do something about it. And that report was, in turn, was very critical in eventually resulting in President Clinton in 1994 issuing the Environmental Justice Executive Order, which calls on all the agencies of the federal government, not just the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, to take into account the environmental justice consequences of their actions. That executive order served as a model for many state governments around the U.S. to formulate their own environmental justice policy, and I think that in terms of government discussion about environmental justice, and certainly academic discussion, the academic discussion was virtually non-existent in 1987, but that has really mushroomed in the U.S. and in places around the world. So the issue, I think, is very well known by government agencies in the U.S. and certainly by academics. If there's any place where we need to make more progress, is actually in the policy making, because even though over time government's attention to environmental justice has been a welcome event, they haven't really, until this point in time, amounted to too much more than statements of good intentions. And I see the next phase really in the U.S. and other places around the world to pass laws that would make environmental justice a requirement, not simply an option.